Prydain, Book 1. Redemption. Written by Robert Faulkner, narrated by Michael Troughton. A foreword from the author. Redemption, isn't that what we all secretly desire? In the declining phase of the Roman Empire, in a time of violence and social change, some people were lucky enough to find it. I have sacked the history and mythology of the native British and the Anglo-Saxons unashamedly. After all, these great traditions are mine by right of blood. Redemption tells the story of a boy as he grows into a man and then a king. We see the influences that shape him: Roman, Celtic and Germanic, the people who support him and those who stand in his path. Great loves and great friendships develop and are lost as he moves in this world and sometimes strays into another more magical realm. The Britain I knew as a child was forged at the end of the Roman Empire. The intertwining of Celtic, Germanic and Roman civilizations created the country I love. Though I still live in the land of my birth, it has changed so much. Some things for the better, some things for the worse. It is good living in such a time, to examine our origins, for our legends tell us so much about who we are. Chapter 1. A Druid's Dream. Merlin awoke sweating. Placing his hands over his eyes, he tried to obscure the confusion of his dream. Pushing the furs to one side, he rose from the bed, first taking a drink of water, and then sitting staring into the middle distance, he tried to make sense of it all. It had been a full moon that night, his mother's favourite time, the time when she was at her strongest and most influential. She hadn't tried to contact him in so long. Truth be told, they hadn't been close in life, so there hadn't been a strong bond or thread that she could have taken with her into the other world. Nonetheless, she was trying to contact him now. The message must have been important. He had had a vision of spirits of land and water moving, preparing for some threat. He had seen glimpses of darkness, a force alien to his island of Prydain, but had awoken before the dreams had ended. After a time, the Druid ventured back to his bed. He pulled the furs around himself as protection from the chill, but his mind was still active, and sleep didn't come easily. Eventually he slipped away into a state where he was closer to the more magical realm, the Otherworld. As sometimes happens, the dream seemed to continue from the point at which he had awoken. The old sword, Caliph Volk, lay on the ground, half hidden in a thick mist. The blade was a gift from the deities of the land, the sword of the chosen warriors, men blessed and anointed by water goddesses. A hand reached for the blade, gently, its fingers intertwining around the human-shaped handle. But only when the sword was lifted out of the mist did its full beauty become apparent. The dream continued, but fell into a disturbing confusion of shapes and sounds. The Druid hadn't slept soundly for some time. He wasn't a man prone to nightmares, but recently his mind was becoming very troubled. There were places where the veil between this world and the other were thinner than elsewhere. Just such a place was the Rowan Grove near the dwelling of Merlin's old friend Center. Over a breakfast of barely edible porridge, Merlin decided to combine a visit to Center with an effort to obtain a clearer, more coherent dream vision. Merlin stopped at the Rowan Grove on the way to his friend's farm. It sent a chill down his spine. Not all visions brought with them good omens. If those of the other world were trying to communicate with him then, he thought, they must want something of him. The Druid knew only too well that spirits and ancestors could be very demanding. There was no point in entering the glade before the time was right. It was with perhaps a little relief that he continued his journey. The track was well made if overgrown. Far too much effort had been put into its construction to merely access a humble farm. Climbing to the top of a not unsubstantial hill, the Druid caught his first sight of Centre's dwelling. It must have been quite impressive in its time. Now just a couple of original rooms were intact. Amidst the ruins, the mosaics had been broken by roots and were now covered in leaves. The land once conquered was fighting back. However, a little of Rome remained. Centre stood 5 feet 5 inches tall, not that short for the time, but what he lacked in height he made up for in bulk. He looked to all intent and purposes like a native. Only his dark Mediterranean complexion marked him out as a foreigner. Centre had found a more useful purpose for the once well-manicured garden. It now served as an equally well-tended vegetable patch. Most of the crop was stored or drying in a space that was once used to entertain guests. The old bathhouse, though small, stored enough water to ensure the old man and his family didn't have to constantly travel to the spring, whilst the slave quarters now housed the cattle, animals that had given up freedom for an easier, more predictable life. Perhaps not a bad bargain if one doesn't stop to think about the unenviable outcome of this exchange. Centre smiled at the children playing. The youngest looked so much like his wife, Caddy. Caddy's grave lay east to west within the boundary of the villa. It hadn't seemed right to bury her away from the living as his custom would have dictated. "Centre!" The call startled the old Roman. "When are you going to stop creeping up on people, Merdin?" Centre replied with only a little air of annoyance. "I bring gifts, and this is my welcome." Merdin smiled as he raised a large container of mead. "Well, gifts, that is different, you old charmer of snakes." Centre held back a smile. "Piran is here to save you from your heathen ways." The hint of sarcasm in Centre's voice wasn't lost to his friend. "I'd rather think I've done a better job at saving him with my heathen ways. Where is the old fool?" It had been over 40 years since the Druid and the Greek monk Piran had first met. Merdin glanced around, noting people piling up firewood in preparations for the winter. He couldn't see Piran anywhere. "In there, drinking my cider." Centre rolled his eyes. "Well, let's stop wasting time and join him." Merdin confidently moved towards the entrance. Centre had a slight limp and was a little slower. They found Piran and exchanged greetings. Piran and the Druid sat together while Centre poured cider into 3 large pewter tankards before taking a seat opposite his friend. "It is good to see you both," Merdin proclaimed. "The cider is excellent, and I trust the mead is up to the usual quality?" Piran eyed the mead bottle with a lustful intensity. The 3 men talked and drank. As the drink flowed, they talked more. Old stories they had all heard before. "The Pict hit the shield wall so hard," Centre started, "that our feet were pushed into the ground. Halfway up our calves," Piran completed the old Roman sentence. Centre was undaunted, lifting his tunic to show his dark shoulder. "Look, my collarbone sprung out of its setting. The force was so great." "Yes, but still you fought on," Piran again intervened. All 3 men were laughing, even though Centre was trying hard not to. "I first met you that day." Centre looked thoughtful at Merdin. "We had never fought on the same side as Western Prydains before." Centre examined his friend. Age had been very kind to him, he thought. Merdin may have slightly more grey hair, but other than that, he hadn't changed much. Piran, overcome with seriousness, continued. "The world is very different now, and we have Scotti, Picti, and Germani to threaten us." Merdin replied in his usual straightforward, honest manner. "Things balance out sooner or later. They always do." They talked until late evening, but Merdin declined the chance to sleep under the comfort of a roof, even though there was a marked chill in the air. The dreams were still in the forefront of his mind. He needed to make his way to the Rowan glade and sleep there. A little reluctantly, the Druid entered the sacred space, ensuring that he showed due respect by bowing and announcing his presence. A breeze gently moved through the branches of the holly trees. "I am Myrddin, son of Aranthrod and Idwal. I am a Westerner by birth and blood. I wish only to spend the night in your grove to listen more closely to our spirit world." The Druid spoke humbly in the ancient tongue of Prydain, and then waited for a sign. But none came. Hesitantly he turned around in order to leave, but there in his path was a large crow. Man and beast stared at each other. Then the crow made a harsh caw. The bird was determined to guard the exit, and the Druid submitted to its will. He remained in the grove. Lying on the ground, the Druid looked to see if the crow was still there. It was, a silent guardian among the eerily still trees. It was a relief when his fur bag finally rose to his body temperature and began to offer some protection from the cold damp of autumn. A nightcap, drunk quickly due to its foul taste, ushered the advent of sleep. As he had hoped, the dreams were more coherent. In his dreams he saw a young bear cub wandering from a river toward an old fort. Myrddin knew it well. The cub rested on a stone near the fort's entrance. Then the shadows closed in from all sides. The shadows working together covered land and water, but they did not engulf the bear cub. Instead, the darkness parted where he travelled. Myrddin saw that there were other places where the shadows held little sway too, notably around the bonfires burning brightly on the hills, fires lit for the ceremonies of Callan Gia, the most sacred night of Westerners' Celtic calendar, a ceremony that would take place in less than 1 week. Chapter 2. A young boy lost in the wild. This wasn't Rome. There were no neatly paved streets. Indeed, there was no paving at all. Just a rough track, and muddy at that. The young boy found that if he walked in the middle of the track, he could avoid the worst of the mud, but the heavy rain made it impossible not to get wet. Sometimes the trees arched like the roofs of houses, providing some protection. But it was getting dark. As his vision decreased, his ability to hear seemed to increase. He could sense the movement of the trees, of the grass, and the imagined and real beasts to whom this land belonged. He quickened his pace. Had he taken the right track? He had been sure that he was heading back towards the valley, but now he wasn't so certain. The rain eased. He reacted to every sound and movement, wishing deeply that his curiosity hadn't taken him to the river that morning. He begged the gods for his deliverance and promised, well, anything that he thought might bring them to his aid, or at least encourage them to look kindly on his case. He despaired that this wasn't a land mastered by his gods. Just as a thought crossed his mind, light erupted from the summit of a nearby mound. A large fire burning in a vain attempt to subdue the mist. He saw another blaze, followed by another, and another, glowing from the hills and mountains alike. Undulating red stars set against a clouding sky. Before him, the track split into two. He froze, locked inside himself. He just wanted to run, but didn't know where. Logic would have told him to take the dark track, heading towards the wood. A wood made even more menacing as the mist, swirling at first, began to settle. Perhaps it led back to the valley, the river, and even his family. The other track appeared to rise towards the hills. It looked a steep climb, but at least the mist didn't seem so intense. Squinting, he thought he could make out figures moving around the distant fire. Every noise or movement from the surrounding fields urged him to move. But which way? His soaked clothes had almost dried now that the rain had stopped, but the temperature was falling and slight tremors of fear that ran through his body were developing into a more pronounced shaking. He felt a coldness that seemed to pass through his bones. The other boys in the city had talked about the blue men who inhabited this land. He didn't believe in all they said, but the stories of black magic and human sacrifice seemed even more believable in this intimidating landscape. He wasn't going toward the fires, that was for sure.